Hi, my name is Gina Giovinelli, and I am presenting my final project for ICL 7174. So, the topic or the essential question of the project to answer is: what is my role in my students' language learning journey? I personally have outlined four specific points or emphasis that I believe to be the things that I am the most intentional with in order to best serve my students in learning Spanish, which is what I currently teach. I teach high school Spanish 1 and also Spanish 2 honors. So, point number one would be to meet my students where they're at. Number two, to be their guide. Three, to structure my classroom effectively. And number four, to celebrate culture. So, to elaborate on the first point of to meet my students where they're at, four different categories of things is ACTFL proficiency assessments. So, in my classroom, we use a modified version of the ACTFL proficiency oral interview to make a student sample portfolio for the end of the year. So that involves a reading, writing, speaking, which is a modified version of the oral proficiency interview, and then a reflection. In order to gauge our students' progress throughout the year, we do pre assessments and post assessments. So here is one example of from last year, a writing example of the writing pre assessment, which is in the top left corner at the beginning of the year for Spanish 1. This student did had some prior knowledge of Spanish. They took Spanish in middle school. And then in the right hand side is the post assessment, which is at the end of the year after 1 year of instruction in Spanish 1. Here is another student sample of writing. This was from last school year for my personal portfolio. This student is not a native English speaker or Spanish speaker. They're actually a native Arabic speaker, which to me was the most fascinating to see the relationship between learning English and at the same time learning a third language. Which is as an elective class. So on the left is the pre assessment, and on the right is the post assessment, again for writing. Also through differentiation, as well through guided notes. I have an example of two guided notes that I use in my class. I think that guided notes are some of the most important parts of differentiation in my classroom, and as well as modifications. I can make multiple versions of the same notes and give them to students according to their needs in order to help them better get the information down, especially for visual learners. And it kind of gives the students something to do for the kids who like to walk around the room. So this is an example from Unit 2 from doing verbos reflexivos in mi rutina diaria for Spanish 2. And then on the right side is an example of Spanish 1, Unit 1, which is the Spanish basics. And then lastly, just to teach interests, I think that it's really important in order to engage our students and to increase student learning. I think it's important to assess their interests and then use that to create our vocabulary or to create the output or the input that our students are going to receive. This is an example from the virtual school year from 2 years ago. I did a Nearpod in one of my Spanish 1 classes during Unit 2 to talk about different movies and show genres. And I took a student survey at the beginning of the unit to kind of see what everybody liked to watch and things like that. And then I used that to create the vocabulary list. And we collaborated together to kind of have a classroom virtual discussion on the Nearpod collaborative board about the things that we like to watch. Point two is to be my student's guide. I think my role, principally as an educator, is to guide my students in their learning. I think that learning is kind of like a self motivated thing. If the student has a desire to learn, then they will learn. But our responsibility as an educator is to be their guide. Three things that I use is through activities, projects, and grammar. I have a couple samples from my classroom as well. This is from a few weeks ago, a gallery walk in my classroom. The students were doing a gallery walk for descriptive adjectives or adjetivos descriptivos. On the left is a student letter. This student is in my Spanish 1 class, and he is of Guatemalan, but he is learning Spanish as his third language because he speaks a dialect. This is an example of one of my activities as a summative assessment and in kind of like an information exchange. My students have pen pals in the ESL classes, and they write letters to each other and they switch back and forth, kind of reviewing as a summative assessment the things that we've learned in that unit. On the right side is an activity that we did in my class for emociones or sentimientos, emotions or feelings, using the verb estar. Number three is to structure my classroom effectively. Mainly this includes modeling, grouping, and planning effectively, but there are 5 points that I want to elaborate on that we have learned specifically in the textbook for this course and also within the course, the different resources. The first one being communicative language teaching. Communicative language teaching is basically an approach to teaching language that aims at communication rather than linguistic competence. That means that the main goal of your classroom or my classroom should be that students are communicating and I am communicating with my students and they are communicating back to me, which is similar to language as a whole, which the main goal of language is to communicate. Also, through comprehensible input, basically increasing input acquisition by producing language that is easy for students to process and recycle. So, it involves breaking down our language as educators and being very intentional with the output that we produce, which will in turn be our students' input, that it's in a way that our students can easily acquire and process and then recycle that language later on. Also, through the total physical response model, I use a modified version of this in my classroom. It's basically using meaning bearing tasks and actions. For example, when I say modified, I mean as in when you are teaching vocabulary, or if a student asks you, they say, ¿Cómo se dice to eat in Spanish? You would say, oh, comer, or they would say, ¿Qué significa comer? And you would say, comer significa, and using physical response to kind of model the meaning without translating to the student. Also, like a task base, saying colorear, rojo, el animal on the paper to color the animal red, or to have students using on a sheet to say circular los adjetivos en el párrafo, to circle, circular the adjectives in the paragraph, etc. Also, through information exchange, these are activities that allow for communication within the context of the language. In my classroom, this looks like student surveys, doing student interviews, like a peer, turn to a peer, think, pair, share, things like that, interviewing a family member at home, doing a Venn diagram to compare with your partner, your likes and differences, and then also the letter exchange that I referenced earlier. I think this is like a very summative example of an information exchange task. However, it is in exchanging information in the target language with meaning behind it, and also through differentiation. And lastly, to celebrate culture in the classroom. I think that, as referenced in the textbook, that communicative language teaching, it should be an extension of the outside world, and I really believe that the language classroom is and it should be an extension of the target language culture as well. In the same way we teach language, we teach culture and we teach communication and kind of social cultural competence. In my classroom, this is my favorite thing to do. This is what I pride myself most on as an educator, is cultural activities and cultural based lessons. In my school, which is a 56% Spanish speaking population, we do a Hispanic Heritage Month event, Dia de los Muertos activities. We participate in the City of Memphis parade. We do music, creative projects. I am a sponsor for International Club at my school. And I think, again, reiterating the high Spanish speaking population or Hispanic or Latino population at my school, I think it's important to reinforce the beauty of my students' culture. Being that even though I teach an introductory course, the majority of my classes are still Spanish speakers. And I think it's important to positively teach and to positively show their culture in the classroom to not only students of that culture, but also to all students of all cultures. This is an example of this year in my classroom. This is una ofrenda, or an offering that we made, my students, my Spanish 1 students, for Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead. The butterflies, which is a symbol of Day of the Dead, students wrote the names of a person who passed away in their life that they would like to honor. And this is 100% student made. On the right is my international club when we participated in the Dia de los Muertos parade at the Brooks Museum. We made an ofrenda to honor El Chavo del Ocho, or Roberto Bolaños, who was the actor that played El Chavo. Also, on the left, this is a mural that my students made. This is so beautiful, in the hallway at my school for Dia de los Muertos. And on the right is my Spanish 1 students that are making flores de cempasúchil for Day of the Dead this year, too. On the left, then my Spanish 2 honors class, we do an enrichment project, which involves making mate bark paintings and using oil pastel to recreate a cultural symbol, or alebrije, which is an Aztec spirit animal and cultural symbol for Dia de los Muertos. And on the right is my Spanish 2 honors from last year. We made hojalata projects for our second semester enrichment project. I like to involve a creative or artisanal project for the enrichment projects, because I think that that is a really big part of the Hispanic and Latino culture, is the artesanía, or artisan work and handmade crafts. And I think that that's very fun and enriching for my students. Here is a rubric, my rubric that I created for myself for this project. It has 4 different categories: project content, effort and professionalism, practical application, examples, and audio and video content, and then 4 different standards for the rubric. At the bottom, it's out of 80 points, and it gives space for feedback. My personal score and my feedback for myself will be attached to my final assignment. Thank you so much, Dr. Knowles, and also to the other student in the class. Here are my sources for my final project, and thank you very much.